Let's cut through the BS that the attacker suffers 3 times more losses than the defender. No matter what the Russians do, they lose 3 times more.
So if Ukraine is losing 100 soldiers a day, which is roughly 1 company of troops per day, Russia is losing this many troops per day, or roughly 1 battalion tactical group.
There is no historical foundation to this claim. If what he said was true, how can we explain the 2003 invasion of Iraq? The attacker, the coalition, lost 700 KIA or wounded, while the defending Iraqis are believed to have lost 45,000 casualties. The ratio was 1 coalition soldier for 64 Iraqi military personnel. And in this case, we're even talking about urban operations. Casualties mainly depend on tactics and the difference in firepower between both sides. If MMA fighter Khabib attacked you and your buddies, who do you think would take more damage? You won't even have time to blink that you all be on the floor. The actual 3-to-1 rule of combat states that in order for the attacker to win the battle, his forces should be at least 3 times the force of the defender. The 3-to-1 rule is a rapport de force, a balance of power. Nowhere does it state that the attacker suffers 3 times more casualties than the defender. Oh my god, I almost forgot. What is a casualty? Normie journalists always confuse casualties with fatalities. Long story short, a casualty is someone that cannot fight anymore. That takes into account dead, but also wounded, sick, missing, or captured soldiers. And the word losses is a synonym for casualties. And then there is some terminology. KIA means killed in action. Hello my friends and welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukraine war. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. There's a very high likelihood that this video is going to be demonetized. So if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my PayPal or Patreons, the links are in the description. With that being said, welcome to the headquarters. Today we're going to talk about casualties, but before we talk about this very sensitive topic, remember that this isn't a football game. There is no scoring. We're talking about people. Don't forget that each one of these casualties is someone's son, father, brother, or husband. For example, in this video we have a wounded Ukraine soldier saying, "I'm married, I will soon have a child, and I cannot die." Honestly, this video wasn't easy to watch. It just cannot leave you insensitive. The reason I'm doing this video is because in my previous video I mentioned some casualty estimates for both sides and I received 1,000 comments asking me to explain these numbers. So I'll first show you Russian casualty figures and then we'll move on to Ukrainian ones. Are you ready, boys? We're back to school. Pencil, paper, calculator. Russian casualties. So in this article, Ukrainian armed forces claim that 540 Russian troops had been KIA over the past 24 hours. Officially, the Ukrainian military claims that the Russian death toll is 97,000 and over 291,000 wounded. 40% of all the Russian armed forces gone. As of now, the only entity that keeps a rigorous record of losses is the Donetsk People's Republic. Every week they release a report of injuries and fatalities, both civilian and military. For example, in this chart between the 2nd to the 8th of December, they reported 58 KIA and 248 wounded, with an average of 8 KIA per day. I know it's written in Russian, but here's the same chart written in English, but from early November, but that way you can easily translate. Anyway, what was really interesting is that the actual ratio between wounded and KIA is not 3-to-1. It's actually 1 fatality, 1 KIA for 4 wounded. Overall, in 2022 up until mid-December, the DPR military lost 4,059 KIA and 17,153 wounded in action. Not gonna lie, those are quite significant. Over 21,000 casualties. The main reason that could explain that is 1. They constantly fought against heavily fortified positions, and 2. They're mainly an infantry force and benefited from little armored support, thus increasing losses. Officially, these losses represent 108% of the contingent that started the war. Could it be that the entire DPR corps was replaced with new guys? Maybe, but That seems highly unlikely to me. In my opinion, if a DNR soldier got wounded twice during the war and returned to the front each time, he still got accounted for 2 times. Imagine guys that got 3 injuries. So I don't think it's actually 17,000 individuals that got wounded. For example, in this interview, this DPR soldier said that he has been fighting for 8 years. He said that recently 4 men of his squad were sent to the rear. One was wounded and another was shell-shocked. He says that only these 2 are still at the rear, but that they should return to the front within a week. So this is a good example. 4 guys with injuries that are sent back to their unit right after. We also don't know the severity of the injuries reported by the Donetsk People's Republic. It could be a guy that lost his leg, or someone that got stung by a bee while doing a TikTok challenge. So these were the losses reported by the Donetsk People's Republic. What about Luhansk? Well, they don't provide any information, but according to some open source data, the LPR has suffered around 1,100 KIA. This could be explained by the fact that Luhansk militiamen face less resistance than the ones in Donetsk. So as of now, we have Donetsk and Luhansk militiamen together at roughly 5,159 KIA. But now the most important, what about the Russian armed forces? So there is this anti-Putin Russian language media based in Estonia, funded by the BBC, called Mediazona. They actually came up with a very detailed account of Russian military fatalities. Their methodology was very interesting. They say, Mediazona, working with a team of volunteers, is reviewing posts on social media, reports in local media, and authorities' statements. Now let's compare something. According to official figures from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, dated the 1st of December 2022, 16,970 Russian troops have been KIA in November alone. Meanwhile, during that same period, Mediazona reported 905 KIA. That's nearly 20 times less. According to Mediazona, we average about 30 KIA per day on average, compared to the Ukrainian claim of over 500 military deaths every day. Overall, since the beginning of the war till the 15th of December, Mediazona reported 10,229 KIA from Russia. To me, this is as close as we can get to the actual number. What I like about this website is that there is a lot of interesting information, lots of maps and graphs. For example, according to them, the 3 bloodiest days of the Russian army were around the 12th of March, 95 KIA, the 24th of February, day 1 with 100 fatalities, and then the 6th of March with 125 deaths. But even that's not entirely accurate, and Mediazona explains it. This number is not equal to the number of casualties per day. If the report does not mention the date, we use the date of its publication. That is the earliest date we know when the person was confirmed to have been killed. But overall, we clearly see that the first days of the invasion were extremely bloody for Russia. Daily Russian losses decreased from February to the end of August, and then bounced back in September during Ukraine's set of offensives, with a max of 79 KIA around the 24th of November. But it's still nowhere near the same casualty rates as in the first 2 months. It's also noteworthy to see where these soldiers came from. If we take a look at the Chechens, they're officially part of the National Guard of Russia, so they should be included in Mediazona's figures. And I was shocked, only 140 KIA. Perhaps we overestimated Chechen losses because of their TikTok exploits, and because of that we overestimated their involvement. Or perhaps a lot of Chechens are officially registered in other regions like Moscow or Dagestan, that also has a big Chechen diaspora. Overall, here are the 9 oblasts, the Russian regions that suffered the most losses. Number 1 is Los Cubanos. Actually, a lot of Cossack regiments in the Russian military come from Kuban, and they have been fighting a lot. Otherwise, like we said, a lot of guys from Dagestan and from the Urals region, Siberia, like Buryatia, Yekaterinburg, Chelyabinsk, Rostov, and Volgograd, the former Stalingrad. It's very interesting. This confirms the fact that over the years, the Russian military mainly attracted recruits from Russia's poorest regions. So it makes sense that they're overrepresented in the military. Russian Minister of Defense Shoigu claimed on September 21st that 5,937 Russian servicemen had been KIA'd since the beginning of the war. Now here's a little trick that the Russian government uses to lower their casualties. A lie by omission. They specifically talk about Russian armed forces, but ignore the huge losses of Donetsk and Luhansk militias, since they're considered to be independent from the Russian armed forces. So Shoigu said 5,937 by the 21st of September. Let's check on Mediazona. During the same period, they claimed the death of 7,515 military personnel. A 26% difference. Statistically speaking, that's a huge difference. One explanation could be that the Russian Ministry of Defense is simply lying. The other option is that his data was perhaps 1 or 2 weeks outdated by the time he announced it. For example, on the 25th of March, Shoigu spoke of 1,351 Russian soldiers KIA, which according to Mediazona corresponds to the losses up until the 13th of March. Basically the same thing. But once again, all this reinforces the methodology and numbers reported by Mediazona. Now, what are the losses of the Summer Crossbows Army? The Wagner PMC. Mediazona claims that as of December 16th, 120 deaths of the PMC's fighters have been confirmed. These 120 deaths don't include prisoners who were recruited by the Wagner group. Up until now, we know of 110 inmates who were recruited from the Russian penal colonies and died in the war. Confirmed total for Wagner, 230 KIA. It's also interesting to know that roughly 39 foreigners are reported to have been KIA. Now, according to Ukrainian figures, by the 6th of November, the musicians had suffered between 800 and 1,000 KIA. This is gonna be difficult, but let's cut the apple in two. Let's assume 800 KIA for Wagner. These troops are specialized assault units. They suffer significant casualties, but only during specific attack missions. They're not constantly on the front. Anyway, what's important for us to know is that Wagner losses are included in Mediazona. So what are the final numbers for Russia? We said roughly 5,000 KIA for Donetsk and Luhansk. Now for casualties from Russia, meaning the Russian armed forces, the Chechens, and the Wagner PMC. 10,229 KIA plus an extra 800 for Wagner. Total 15,988 deaths. Let's round up to 16,000. We can also see the heavy losses of Donetsk and Luhansk fighters. Despite representing roughly 10% of Russian forces, they suffered a third of all combat fatalities. Let's go back to the official figures of the Ukrainian MOD. 97,000 KIA. 6 times more. Oh, there's something weird in this coffee. This coffee is really strong. Now, counting how many Russian soldiers were wounded will be very difficult. We could use the same 4-to-1 ratio as for Donetsk, but it's very likely that Russian soldiers have better equipment, better body armor, and overall better medical services. So the ratio could be 1 fatality for 6 wounded. But let's say we take an average of 1 KIA for 5 wounded. The Russian armed forces then suffered 55,000 wounded. That means overall for Russia, we have 16,000 KIA and 72,000 wounded. And that sums up to 88,000 casualties. Interestingly, the number is not too far away from what General Milley announced on the 10th of November, that Russia had lost 100,000 soldiers killed or wounded. Now, from anecdotal stories I heard or read, if a Russian soldier is wounded, he's not supposed to return to the front. In other reports, they mention it's 50-50 depending on the severity of the injury. In a recent Telegram post, Russian medics claimed that 70% wounded were caused by explosive and mine fragments, 10% by disease, 10% by gunshot wounds, and 10% by accidents. Question remains, how many of these injured soldiers return to the front? Sometimes a wounded Russian soldier will in fact return to the front, but not as part of a combat unit. Overall, it seems that Russia wants to keep their combat veterans alive. There were reports where wounded veterans were the ones training the newly mobilized troops, or simply went to talk to them, tell them about life at the front, tips and tricks on how to survive in combat conditions. There's also a lot of emphasis on training mobilized personnel on how to conduct care under fire, like how to evacuate wounded soldiers or on how to use tourniquets. So why did Russia mobilize 300,000 men? It allows them to fill in the gaps in military personnel, and it allows them to reach a 3-to-1 numerical advantage necessary for an offensive in some parts of the front. Anyway, according to the latest data available by the 15th of December 2022, we're looking at 16,000 Russians KIA. Ukrainian casualties. The problem for analysts is that Ukrainian officials prefer to avoid discussing casualty figures altogether. So disclaimer, we're walking into uncharted territory.
Fuck.
On the 20th of June, in an interview with journalist Dmitry Gordon, Arestovich, an advisor to President Zelensky, claimed that the Ukrainian army had lost about 10,000 killed, and using a 3-to-1 ratio, another 30,000 were wounded since the beginning of the war. Now that's very strange because on the 2nd of December, Podolyak admitted that Ukraine had lost between 10,000 and 13,000 soldiers KIA. The same number? What happened in July, August, September, October, November, December? Ukraine casualties have stagnated. They keep saying 10,000. Is it some Ukrainian slang to say I have no effing clue what I'm talking about? I swear, Ukrainian air defense shoot down 10,000 Russian missiles today. And then we have to address the big scandal when Ursula von der Leyen, no other than the president of the European Commission, perhaps in some sort of Freudian slip, on Twitter spoke of 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead.
More than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
Sounds pretty clear to me, but let's listen to it once again.
More than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
Don't tell me that this 100,000 figure came out of nowhere. They immediately deleted the video and reposted it without that part. That's 10 times more than what Ukraine claims. And all that Ukrainian officials could come up with was to say that it was a typo. That it was actually 10,000 KA. Yes, it was the typo for the president of the European Commission. Why invest in artillery and tanks? Russia has 10 times more firepower, but they still suffer 10 times more casualties. To be honest, if our browsing community is wild, the Russian one is also completely nuts. They claim that the Ukrainian army lost 387,000 soldiers KIA. That's not serious. There's also the case of missing Ukrainian soldiers that complicate this entire thing. I know the story is anecdotal, but it's a report of a soldier that got KIA'd, but officially marked as missing. And then a group of hackers allegedly hacked into the correspondence of the chief of the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they allegedly found a complete list of all the missing soldiers of the Ukrainian army. They claim over 35,000 soldiers missing, presumed dead, but their families will not receive compensation because they're still missing. Could be true, but could also be very easy to fake. Then there's this alleged report I saw on Telegram from Ukrainian obituaries dated on the 3rd of December 2022. They report 102,000 KIA. They claim they use social media posts to gather these figures, but since there's so little information, it's hard to prove the validity of these figures. To me, this map where you see where the soldiers come from and everything is very interesting, but I can't use it, I can't take it seriously. Now, according to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, at the moment, the number of military deaths of the Ukrainian armed forces amount to 135,000. They probably added the 100,000 KA figure and added the 35,000 missing. Meanwhile, some Russian military bloggers said that according to his estimates, the irretrievable losses of the Ukraine military, meaning KIA captured or missing, range between 130,000 and 160,000, and that the total amount of wounded is between 200 and 250,000. That would mean that for every 2 fatalities, you have 3 wounded. The problem with all these reports is that it's just numbers. There's no document or methodology behind. I wonder, how did they get to these figures? According to the latest news, new documents were made public regarding the soldiers missing in action. There are now more than 3,000 names in one list of missing from the Ukrainian Navy, mainly Marine infantry. They suffered heavy losses in Mariupol and thus their bodies would still not be found. Let me show you my method how I estimated Ukrainian casualties, and if you find any flaws, I would be happy that you improve the methodology. We know that the majority of Ukrainian losses are due to artillery. For example, this footage is extremely interesting. It shows the advance of a Ukrainian squad near Bakhmut, and suddenly they get fired at by some mortars. 3 or 4 mortar shells fall onto their position, and in the end they suffer 1 KIA and 1 wounded, and they have to pull back. I thought of this method to calculate Ukraine casualties when preparing my last video. When I read this article from the Financial Times, it said, over the course of Monday morning, when the FT visited, there was rarely more than 5 seconds between artillery explosions. So that means that every hour, Russia fires 720 shells of various sizes in the sector of Bakhmut. If we assume that the Russians fire 16 hours a day at the same rhythm, that means roughly 11,500 explosions. And let's be honest, such a high number is highly plausible. Look at this footage of a Russian tank driving into Bakhmut. The city is destroyed. It's pure rubble. At the same time, we also know that Ukraine casualties in Bakhmut are extensive. It's the first time we actually have Western journalists simply reporting what they see. On French TV, this Ukrainian-French doctor that volunteered in Bakhmut said, on a calm day, we receive 100 to 150 wounded. On offensive days, we get up to 300 wounded a day, and that is at his one location. The New York Times reported the day before their arrival, 240 people had come through the hospital doors, with everything from gunshot wounds to shrapnel injuries and concussions. Let's say that Ukraine suffers 750 casualties in the Bakhmut sector. If we take the basis that on average for every 6 casualties we have 5 wounded and 1 fatality, that's 150 KIA per day. Now we glue everything together. 11,520 explosions in Bakhmut equals 150 KIA per day. In a rough estimate, it's 77 shells or explosions per KIA. That's not the actual number. I don't know the actual number. It's just a way of measuring things. I'm well aware that their mines, their rockets, their helicopters, aviation, machine guns, and all this. It's just that I think that there's a correlation between the number of explosions and the number of fatalities. The war has been going on for roughly 300 days, with an average of 25,000 Russian artillery shells every 24 hours, for a total of 7,500,000 explosions. Now we divide this amount of explosions by 77 explosions per KIA, and the result we get is 97,000 KIA for the Ukrainian army. That's why I said 100,000 KIA estimated for Ukraine in my previous video. Now I'm sure you guys can refine this very rough methodology. Simply let me know in the comment section. Now let's say it was actually 500 KIA or wounded per day in Bakhmut. Total Ukraine military fatalities then dropped to 65,000. You know what, if you want, we can even use this number instead. In that case, it's very interesting. It's very similar to the ratio of losses during Israel's offensive against Hezbollah in 2006. The casualty ratio was for every 1 attacker, 4 defenders. In both situations, it was an armored attacker with a firepower advantage against a more mobile infantry-based army, fighting from heavily entrenched positions with tunnels and concrete bunkers. And in both conflicts, we faced an attacker that tried to limit casualties as much as possible, and thus the rate of advance was slow. However, one problem in my calculation is that it's linear. When we saw in Mediazona that Russian fatalities are not linear. There are a lot of ups and downs. The foundation of the method I'm using is Russian shelling on the Ukrainian army defending Bakhmut. It's a bias. I chose a very specific scenario, and I use this to extrapolate information. But what about Ukrainian casualties when they went on the offensive in open terrain from late August to late October? Here's what American Colonel McGregor had to say.
The counterattacks that we saw over the last several months, it started out with 30, 40, 50,000 troops, then declined to perhaps 10,000, 12,000. They declined further to 3,000 to 5,000. And recently we've seen battalion-sized units, 500, 600, 700, actually trying to probe and walk through Russian defenses. The problem is the Ukrainian casualties have been horrendous, particularly over the last few months. There was an article today in the Euro News. I'm told there's another one in the New York Times describing the very, very heavy casualties. Of course, the big lie that is always told to accompany the bad news is, well, the Russians have taken heavy casualties too. Nonsense. The Russians have not.
Let's say that during this period, Russian artillery explosions were twice more likely to cause casualties. In the end, for these roughly 70 days of offensive, we get 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers KIA. Now we don't want to double count, so after adjusting the losses, in this scenario, Ukraine's total military fatalities would be 80,000, assuming there was indeed over-mortality during Ukraine's set of offensives. Then we have fellow YouTuber Military Summary. He kept a daily record of Ukrainian losses in personnel and equipment, I think from daily reports of the Russian Ministry of Defense. In the end, he claims at least 83,000 Ukrainian soldiers KIA. I don't know, his 83,000 Ukrainian soldiers KIA is very close to my worst case scenario, 80,000. That would mean that for every Russian, you have 5 Ukrainian soldiers. And I agree, even I was shocked. Now, how many Ukrainian soldiers wounded? Let's use the same baseline, 5 wounded for 1 fatality. That would be 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers that have been wounded. But I don't want to put too much emphasis or importance on this number, because it doesn't mean anything. Just like with DPR soldiers, I heard stories of Ukrainian soldiers that got wounded 3 times throughout the war and they always return to the front. Whenever possible, wounded Ukrainians get patched up and are sent back to their unit as soon as possible. Maybe not directly on the front, but perhaps somewhere at the rear in reserve. Of course, unless they're severely injured and that they can't fight anymore. In that case, the war is over for them. And this method of doing is very close to what the US Army did during World War II. This allows Ukraine to maintain a huge pool of manpower available at all times. And let me be clear, it's not because Ukraine might have more losses that is the indicator that they're losing the war. If the enemy has 10 times more firepower, it's normal that you might suffer more casualties. If Ukraine did in fact enlist 1 million men, Ukraine can replace its losses. And whether you put a conscript with a 3-day military training crash course in the foxhole or a Navy SEAL, the effect of an enemy artillery shell will be exactly the same. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description.